It's an odd fact of history, but about every 80 years the United States goes through the same sad cycle. First, we have an economic depression, followed by a major war. This cycle started way back in the 1770s with the Revolutionary War. And then about 80 years later, we had the Civil War. And then about 80 years later, we had World War I and World War II. And now it's been about 80 years since World War II, and we're about to repeat the same sad cycle over again. Now, how can I be so sure? Well, first of all, you got the 80-year cycle, which is pretty convincing. But there are two other indicators I watch very closely. During economic boom times, debt tends to accumulate. In the latter stages of a boom, lending standards are usually relaxed. Borrowing increases, more and more people borrow more and more money, and soon the total debt becomes so huge it becomes obvious it's never going to be repaid. But if it's not going to be repaid, how can we ever get rid of it? The only way to rid ourselves of all this accumulated debt is to erase it during an economic depression. Massive personal, government, and commercial bankruptcies will wipe away the debt once and for all. Today, in our country, city, county, state, federal, personal, and corporate debt are all at or near record levels. An economic depression will quickly do away with all this debt. The other key indicator I watch is the income gap between the income of the rich and the income of the rest of us. During boom times, all wages rise, but as the boom matures, the income of the rich tend to rise more quickly than other wages. Here's a shocking fact. If you look up the income gap in 1929, just before the stock market crash that triggered the Great Depression of the 1930s, you'll find the ratio is the same as it is right now. It's the same ratio. So these two indicators are sending a clear message. Hard times are ahead. I'm going to give you the 5 reasons why I feel World War III is imminent. I'm sure you'll feel the same way I do after you see the advantages such a war would provide the military-industrial complex that now rules our government. First, a world war would stimulate our economy like nothing else. Remember, it was World War II that pulled us out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. I'm sure we can all agree that our weak economy could use a boost. Factories would hire millions of workers, wages would surge, and retail sales would increase, just as they did following the U.S. entry into World War II. Secondly, we have the greed of the military-industrial complex insiders. They are a very greedy bunch that go to sleep each night praying for a big, big war. Thousands of them would get rich off lucrative military contracts. Many of these greedy war profiteers would become millionaires, and some would become billionaires once the tsunami of military spending shifts into high gear. The third advantage of World War has to do with the suppression of dissent. Make no mistake, we are headed into some very, very difficult times. Huge riots are in our future. I'm not talking about polite demonstrations. I'm talking about vicious, bloody riots like they had recently in Greece. Whole blocks of buildings were burned to the ground. Policemen and firemen were killed, and the transport of critical food and fuel was disrupted. In a war, dissent is viewed as treason, so most people are going to be reluctant to demonstrate. During such a national crisis, dissenters will tend to stay home. The fourth advantage is that a world war would help extend the life of our military empire. We have a huge military empire. Over the past decade, U.S. industrial and financial influence has waned. China is now the biggest manufacturer in the world. Many countries are now using their own currencies for international trade, where in the past they used to depend on the U.S. dollar. All we have left as a nation is our military, and a world war now would help us extend our military hegemony for another decade or more. The fifth and last advantage is going to hit home, I promise you. Ever since Roosevelt launched the New Deal back in the 1930s, and Johnson created the Great Society in the 1960s, the rich have passionately wanted to eliminate all of these programs. They want to kill them all, including Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. But how can they do that? How can they destroy such popular programs? I mean, these programs enjoy a lot of political support in Washington. Their solution is really quite simple. They just have to create a big enough national crisis. Such a crisis will provide them with a perfect excuse to slash benefits. It's just a matter of creating a big enough crisis. A world war would be the perfect excuse to gut these programs. What they're going to do is restrict benefits to only those individuals who are most impoverished. If you have any assets, your benefits will be substantially reduced or completely eliminated. Perhaps now you can see why the suppression of dissent is so important. I'm now going to reveal a deep, dark secret only a handful of rich people know. This may sound strange and you may not want to believe it, but it's true. If you read the biographies of wealthy people from back in the 1930s, you'll know it's true. During an economic depression, while tens of millions of people suffer and go hungry, there are those rare souls who take advantage of the hard times and use them to accumulate huge fortunes. Valuables like jewelry, antique, land, houses, and collectibles change hands in very strange ways during hard times. Those who know how can buy up valuables from desperate people for a tiny, tiny fraction of their true and lasting value. When recovery happens and prices return to normal, these items can be sold for a fortune. Many of the largest family fortunes in the country were accumulated in just this way. Of course, the biggest question is, when is this all going to happen? When is there going to be an economic depression, and when is there going to be a war? Well, the answer is, who knows? Events are notoriously hard to predict. But you can look at one cycle that's very important, and that is the election cycle. Back in 2008, Romney and Obama were slugging it out on the campaign trail, while President Bush was back in the White House doing everything he could do to keep the economy going, because he knew if the economy collapsed, Mr. Romney's chances of being elected would evaporate. The economy collapsed, and Mr. Romney's dream of being president was gone, and Obama was elected in a landslide. Now the shoe is on the other foot. We're in the exact reverse situation. Now Mr. Obama is president, he's in the White House, and he's doing everything he can do to keep the economy afloat so that Hillary Clinton will have a good chance of getting elected in 2016. Will Obama succeed? Will he be able to hold the economy together? I don't think so. I think events are going to overtake him. The fact is, you and your loved ones can live very comfortably and accumulate a fortune during the hard times ahead, or you can suffer like all the rest. The choice is yours. For more information, visit my site at hardtimesgazette.com. Thank you for listening. This is Jim Mercer.